I am Judy Dorsey, and I'm a new C3E ambassador, and I'm also the recipient of the 2012 C3E Award in Entrepreneurship. And I am just delighted to be with you today to be moderating this panel on ensuring equitable access to the clean energy transition. It's clear from the conversation so far at the symposium that this is a topic people are very eager to discuss. Yesterday, speakers and panelists framed this topic as a historic opportunity. One opportunity to be basically upending a long history of disproportionate impacts. So I'm excited to introduce you to today's speakers, highlighting this and other points of discussion so far. First, we've also been discussing how equity is a universally intentional issue when we talk about a just transition, and yet we need to be geographically and culturally flexible. So this is a virtual event. It's kind of clunky for all of us. I appreciate you working through this with me, but I think it's really important for us to get a little geographically grounded as we talk about this conversation. So I'd like to introduce our panelists with that in mind, kind of moving from the West Coast across. We have with us today Yana Garcia from California. She's the Deputy Secretary of Environmental Justice, Border Relations, and Tribal Affairs for the California Environmental Protection Agency. If her name is familiar, it may be because yesterday's keynote speaker, Kate Gordon, the Senior Policy Advisor on Climate out of the Governor's Office in California, gave a nice shout out to Yana's work in yesterday's keynote when discussing equity. Moving more to the middle of the country, I'm joining you today from Fort Collins, Colorado, just up the road from Denver, Colorado, where we are pleased to welcome Alice Jackson. Welcome, Alice, who's the president of Xcel Energy Colorado. Xcel Energy Colorado is a company that serves 1.4 million electric customers and 1.3 million natural gas customers. But I'm sure that Alice can offer us perspectives not just from Colorado, but from the entire region that Xcel Energy serves, including the states of Minnesota, North and South Dakota, Michigan, New Mexico, Texas, and Wisconsin. So moving from the middle of our country further east, welcome as well to our third panelist, Shalanda Baker. Shalanda is a professor of law, public policy, and urban affairs at Northeastern University, and she's also the co-founder and the co-director of the Initiative for Energy Justice. I wanted to acknowledge Christina Garcia, who was the winner this morning of the advocacy topic, and when she specifically acknowledged the inequities and history of genocide and indigenous people, as well as the slavery history in our country on which so much of our infrastructure is built. She acknowledged that specifically from Manhattan, where she was calling in, but I would encourage all of us to be thinking where we are today and the peoples that have led us to where we are and to honor those lands. And so I just wanted to mention that more globally as we go into the next theme that we've been discussing in this conference, which is an intersectional approach. I wanted to thank in particular Martha Broad from the MIT Energy Initiative for collaborating on designing this panel and really helping to secure such an all-star lineup when it comes to intersectionality. We really wanted to have an energy equity expert join us today, and boy did we find it in Shalanda Baker. Among other things, she has a forthcoming book, Revolutionary Power, an Activist Guide in the Energy Transition, in which she argues that energy policy should be the next domain to advance civil rights. We also realize this is a difficult concept and topic to bring to life in the field and making a difference in people's homes every single day. For that, we wanted an industry leader navigating the realities and constraints within a regulated business environment. And with that, again, welcome Alice Jackson. I've had a bit of a front row seat being just up the road from Denver, where Alice is, to the transformation under Alice's leadership that Xcel Energy has undergone in terms of a company that is now a nationally recognized industry leader in delivering affordable and reliable service, providing clean energy choices and reducing carbon and other emissions. So we're excited to hear more from you today, Alice, about how do you navigate that from an equity lens, given the regulatory constraints. But really, when we talk about equity, we think about the clean energy and public health impacts and the personal and community justice issues. And so Yana, we're so grateful and thrilled to have you here sharing your expertise and time with us. Because before coming to the Deputy Secretary for Environmental Justice, Border Relations and Tribal Affairs at California EPA, Yana served as an attorney for Earth Justice and Communities for a Better Environment. Her legal practice areas have focused on environmental justice, civil rights, land use, toxics, and chemical disclosures. So just what an amazing lineup on this kind of intersectional approach. We also talked in preparing for this panel, what about the international conversations? And I thought it was interesting to hear from Martha and also our keynote speaker about other areas in clean energy where we might look to international frameworks. We talked yesterday, for example, in supply chain management. But absolutely, the analogy holds true in energy equity. Just like we talked about social responsibility in the supply chain, this is an area where we can learn from our international partners, thinking about energy as a human right, like water, and thinking about what does it look like when energy becomes democratic and some of the aspirations of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And then the last comment I would just like to make before we jump right into a conversation is that this is not an easy conversation to have. It's not always comfortable. We're all on a journey and learning about equity, both personally and professionally. And so our experts here may push us a little bit today, and I think that's a good thing. Gender leadership doesn't always equal equity. So while we can be celebrating the successes of a decade-long effort by C3E, we can't rest on gender alone, and we can build on this platform of leadership and strength to be inclusive of all. So with that, without further ado, we're going to have just quick introductions from each panelist. We'll have a framing conversation among ourselves, and then I have Emily waiting in the sidelines to help share questions that you all may ask. As a reminder, you can move down on your screen and submit questions as you're hearing this conversation, and then we will get right on to it. So with that, I would like to, looks like I have Alice up first. I would like to, Alice, let's go back beyond equity to the theme of this entire event, which is accelerating change, which we know can be really challenging in larger organizations and a regulated industry. So please tell us about yourself and the work you are doing to accelerate change within the energy industry around these equity considerations.
No, thank you very much. It's such a pleasure to be here with all of you today. And Judy, you did a fabulous job of teeing up this panel. So it's going to be a great conversation. It's an honor to be able to sit here and talk about equity from multiple standpoints. But howdy, everyone. My name is Alice Jackson. I have to throw the howdy in there since this is one of the, A&M is one of the consortium participants, and I am a proud graduate of Texas A&M University. So with that, yes, I at the heart, Judy, I don't think this comes as a surprise to you, but those of you, the rest of you on the line, is I'm actually a computer background. I was a programmer, and so at the heart of it, I'm a geek. And I really do think that that has had an interesting play on the role that I have in utilities and how it's connecting with what it is that we are analyzing and trying to put together as far as the clean energy transition. So it's my pleasure to serve as the president of Xcel Energy here in Colorado and to be part of a utility that has really taken seriously climate change and what direction we can go with our resources on the system. We have long been one of the largest and first integrators of wind energy on our system. And just to give some of you some numbers for this to resonate with, here in Colorado, our peak load consumption for our customers is around 7,000 megawatts. And as of September, we have installed on our system in Colorado over 4,000 megawatts of wind that we're serving our customers with. Now, it hasn't always been that way. It has been a journey with our customers. It has been a journey with the technology and the investments that we've had to make there. But we are positive with what we know about the technology today that we can reach an 80% carbon reduction by 2030. We proudly made that announcement the end of December of 2018 and are finding pathways to success in order to be able to get there. Not only is it going to be wind energy, but it's also going to be solar. And the technology that's available today is going to enable us to reach those targets. We've had some great approvals. We're already on the pathway that by 2025, we're going to have 60% of the energy that's delivered to our customers here in the state of Colorado coming from renewable energy resources. And, you know, a 60% carbon reduction as well from our 2005 levels, which actually beats the Paris Accord. And it's all being done in an economic manner. And that's really where equity comes to play, because when we focus on what it is that we have to achieve, we also have to focus on the guardrails around it. The first guardrail is always going to be reliability. We absolutely have to keep the lights on. We recognize in that the services that we provide, just like you were mentioning, they are a base level to human existence, to survival, to economic development, to vitality. We have to make sure that we're providing that energy to our customers for them to do with it what they will, whether it's heating and cooling their home, or it's building widgets and doing other and employing others in order to be able to make our societies work the way that they do. So that's a very important guardrail for us to keep in mind as we move forward. But the second guardrail is affordability. We don't want it to be, at the end of the day, a household decision between heating and cooling your home or purchasing the food or putting the clothing on your children's backs. It has to be something that we are looking at that really does provide access for everyone and is fair and reasonable as a cost. I'm excited to say that here in Colorado, we've been very successful at meeting those different metrics. Last year, we achieved over a 40% carbon reduction from our 2005 levels, at the same time as we're simultaneously delivering energy to our residential customers that's well over 25% below the national average. That means that we have some work that we have to continue to do, and we have to keep looking at these technologies and pieces to make sure that we can deliver those products and services to our customers in an increasingly clean manner, but very much keeping a focus on that affordability lens. It is such a pleasure to serve in this industry. It is not one that I have to tell you, I went to Texas A&M. I did not go to college saying, yes, utilities, that is where I want to go. And quite frankly, not many people probably do go to high school or college thinking that that's where they're going to end up. But I can tell you from being in the industry now for close to 10 years, I sincerely hope that I get to retire from this industry, because there's no other place where I can serve and touch more lives than what it is that we are doing in this industry, particularly with the focus on the clean energy aspects of moving forward. So with that, Judy, I look forward to the conversation that we're going to be having here today. I'm excited about the future that we can all achieve, the technological advancements that are going to come. And I particularly look forward to talking with you in this panel about the just transition aspects of, as we choose different energy resources, how do we move those communities? How do we concentrate and support those communities in this transition? And how is it going to impact the livelihoods of our own employees as we move forward into consideration of how do we achieve that truly low carbon future? So looking forward to the dialogue.
That's awesome. Thanks so much, Alice. That just gives us all such space for hope to hear about a utility that's actually realizing these goals on the ground, and look forward to the just transition conversation. And speaking of that, I want to go next to Shalanda Baker. And Shalanda, this has been quite the year where 2020 has brought social justice to the forefront of our nation, permeating our conversations related to pretty much everything. So as you introduce yourself, can you tell us about your work at this intersection of racial justice and the transition to clean energy?
Sure. So thank you so much, Judy, for the introduction. And Alice, I'm going to go back and say hook 'em horns to you. I was born and raised in Austin, Texas, so we have a friendly rivalry there. Before I start my remarks, though, I do want to acknowledge that I am dialing in today from what is called Boston, but what is territory that was stolen from the Massachusetts, Nipmuc, and Wampanoag people. And by acknowledging this land, I am also acknowledging their ongoing struggle for sovereignty and self-governance. So a man was lynched on May 25th, and his name was George Floyd. We know that he was murdered because a store clerk called the police because he had passed what appeared to be a counterfeit bill to buy a pack of cigarettes. And so he was murdered in the streets of North Minneapolis. He was an asthmatic. He had heart disease, and an autopsy revealed that he also had COVID-19. And so in many ways, George Floyd is the embodiment of this moment. And so we all flooded the streets, right? We took to the streets to march for Black lives and to march for a transformation of the criminal justice system. But we were not marching for a change in the energy system. And I would argue, and I've argued in my work, that the energy system is not immune from this broader reckoning with racial justice and structural inequality. And that is very much what I've committed my work to. So using George Floyd as a prism through which to view the energy system is useful, right? He had heart disease, he had asthma. He grew up in the 3rd Ward of Houston. And Houston is rife with environmental justice concerns. Robert Bullard, who is sort of the father of the environmental justice movement, wrote prolifically about how Black and brown communities in Houston are right in the shadows of fossil fuel generation and other petrochemical facilities, et cetera, that makes it difficult for them to breathe, right? So they can't breathe. And that is due to the rules and the policies that we've designed to organize our energy system. We know from a study from April published by the Harvard Chan School of Public Health that those who have even a short exposure to air pollution have an increased chance of dying due to COVID-19, as well as suffering some of the sort of comorbidities that make it more difficult to survive COVID-19. And again, that connects back to the way we've designed our energy system. We also know that because of this pandemic, many people are out of jobs, right? Those of us who are able to work from home have this privilege and luxury, but many people are either working on the front lines in low salary or low wage jobs, or they're out of jobs altogether. And utilities all over the country initially initiated moratoria to prevent the shutoff of electric utilities, water utilities, and other things at the beginning of the pandemic. But over the last several months and weeks, those moratoria on utility shutoffs have started to expire. So I lay that out as a sort of foregrounding for the work that I do. So yes, I'm a law professor by day, by night, and increasingly by night, I run an organization called the Initiative for Energy Justice. And I've been very committed to issues of race, indigenous rights, and equity within the energy system for about a decade. My work really started in Mexico back in 2010, when I encountered indigenous peoples who were fighting against large-scale wind energy development. And that for me really just upended my world, because many of us in the environmental movement were sort of fighting for recognition of climate change and more clean energy to be brought on the grid. But these were folks who were fighting against large-scale wind that was displacing them, that was dispossessing them of territorial land, and that was dividing them. It was because the same companies that were engaged in fossil fuel development were engaged in the same type of development in their communities. And so that sparked my interest in understanding the social justice and equity dimensions of our transition away from fossil fuels. My career then took me to Hawaii, where I had a front row seat to that state's energy transition. And I was fortunate to play a disruptive role in that state's transition in terms of bringing equity to the policy debates and conversations. And now with the COVID-19 pandemic, with greater awareness of environmental justice and injustice, and with greater awareness of why we need a climate just future, I feel like my work has really met its moment. So I'm excited to talk about all the things that are on the table. I'm really interested in utilities and regulation and reform. So Alice, it's such a pleasure to be able to share the stage with you. And I look forward to hearing remarks from Yana as well. Thank you.
Well, Shalanda, you really kind of encapsulated a lot of what we've been discussing yesterday about this paradox of the urgency of the matter, but doing it thoughtfully and justly. So thank you for that introduction. And moving then to Yana, in the midst of all of this that Shalanda just teed up for us, those of us in the American West have experienced the worst wildfire season on record. Here in Fort Collins, certainly we're just miles away from, our community was affected by Colorado's largest wildfire in the history of our state. Yesterday, there was discussion about more hurricanes this season than we have letters in the alphabet. So as you kind of introduce yourself, maybe you can share with us sort of your perspective on how your work in clean energy and equity plays into community resilience and these public health and other co-benefits of bringing an equity lens to the clean energy transition.
Sure, thank you. And thank you so much for having me. It is likewise a pleasure to share the virtual stage with both Alice and Shalanda. Really excited to be here. And this is, my first time with this particular group. So a pleasure really to be here with all of you. I am joining from Ohlone territory in Oakland, California. Lucky enough to have grown up here and be here today, as it has become one of the more expensive places to live in this country, and unfortunately a place where too many Oaklanders are unable to afford basic utilities and costs of living. But just by way of, I guess, an introduction preceding that which you gave me, Judy, thank you for that. Prior to becoming an attorney, I'm trained as an attorney as well. I'm from Northeastern School of Law, very proudly, where Shalanda is now and where she also hails from her legal background. I did small scale, what we would consider small scale renewable energy projects on tribal lands throughout the country. And one of the things that I learned that our tribal communities throughout the country and indigenous communities throughout the Americas, as Shalanda was just describing, know all too well is the intimate relationship between our history of expropriation of indigenous lands and the extraction of resources, many of which are used for energy consumption by non-tribal communities. I worked in Minnesota, in Montana, Utah, New Mexico, and Arizona on, again, what we would call small scale solar installation projects and wind projects in communities that have been all but ravaged by fossil fuel production. And the history, I think, around what has led to that type of expropriation of land and resources is important for us to keep in mind as we are thinking about our investment in clean energy options and a clean energy future for our country, particularly if we're focused on equity. In order to be focused on equity, I think we have to recognize where inequities continue to persist. And there are few places that is more blatant than on many of our tribal communities. The railroads, for example, as they've gone through many of our tribal lands, have really laid a foundation for what are now some of the more controversial pipelines that we hear about affecting indigenous communities all across our country. For us in California, the history is a little different with respect to some of our distinct energy projects out here in the West. Hydropower is not unfamiliar to us in our history with some of our dams, as is water access for our large-scale agricultural production throughout our state, and that has affected too many indigenous communities. And how that plays out, I think today, as we're approaching the immediate need, as you were just describing, Judy, to invest in our resilience capacity across our communities, and I'll focus on California since that's where I'm located, is that we see that still today, Native American communities in the state of California are far more likely to be severely impacted by wildfires and by smoke as a result of wildfires. They're also far less likely to have the economic capacity and infrastructural capacity, frankly, to recover from wildfires at the same pace as which we would see recovery in other communities. So again, the history is something that we have to recognize as continuing a legacy of very current disproportionate impacts that affect our day-to-day lives today. With respect to indigenous communities across our state, many of our indigenous people, migrant people, immigrant workers, essential workers that produce much of the food that is not only consumed in the state, but is consumed in the nation and in the world, are also affected by the lack of infrastructure capacity in their communities. They're affected by the lack of access to basic utilities, including heat, power, water, in many of our rural communities throughout our state. So for much of the work that we're doing today, it's incredibly important to look at what these cumulative burdens have meant for communities of color, but also to be very precise in the communities that we are focused on. And as Shalanda mentioned, the intersection between the lack of access to basic infrastructure, basic utilities, the history of disinvestment in communities intentionally really coincides with land use patterns that also show us the over-policing of the same communities, the threatening of the same communities. So we can't expect, vulnerable migrant communities, vulnerable Black communities that are facing threats of eviction to always, be banging at our door, asking us for what they might need with respect to utilities, when the overall burden that they're responding to is so multifaceted and has so many more urgent and pressing needs that they might have front of mind. So it's on us, particularly for me as a public servant, as someone working in government, to take on the responsibility of identifying where those needs might be. And more often than not, unfortunately, I think we see that those burdens are affecting Black, Brown, and Indigenous communities across our country. And we've done a lot of work around identifying them by various other means. But at the end of the day, unfortunately, it really is a question of where our Black and Brown and Indigenous communities are located. And more often than not, we will see a history of disinvestment and the need to invest in critical infrastructure for those communities to build our resilience capacity.
Oh, great. Thank you for that introduction. And to all of our panelists, now that we've had that first round of introductions, I can see already we have some questions coming in, and I'd encourage our audience just from that introduction to be asking questions. We'll be fielding those here shortly, but to move beyond the first introductions to kind of framing this issue, maybe one layer deeper, wanted to do one more kind of round of questions and encourage you all to kind of popcorn style feed off of each other's ideas. And so I'm just going to tee up a question to each of you and kind of get out of the way and let the magic happen for a bit. And then we'll look to our audience for some of the things that they have in mind. So while we have you, Yana, some of the things that you were saying really kind of get to the heart of this next section. I'd really like to kind of focus on sort of 2020 and what we can be doing moving forward and what this kind of pivotal year has really shown us in terms of opportunity and issues. So according to a Bloomberg article, more than 140 cities and counties in California are intended to integrate environmental justice into their long-term community plans over the next 2 years. So kind of what do you see as the types of data, grassroots action, other drivers that are kind of behind this, and what lessons can we take forward from these California communities that are putting environmental justice into their plans?
Sure. So I'll start a little bit with the push around where this came from. California now has a state law called SB 1000, which requires in local land use decision-making the inclusion of an environmental justice element. Whenever a local land use agency is making updates to one or more elements to their general plans, or when they're updating a climate element. So clear relationship to local adaptation and resilience planning. As many of you are likely aware, the general plan process, certainly for us in California, and I think in many other jurisdictions, also involves other critical infrastructure, transportation planning, housing, et cetera. So what we're seeing here in California is a result of decades of movement building from environmental justice advocates, from groups on the ground who have really pushed the state to adopt a cumulative impacts frame. And by that, I mean a frame that really takes into consideration the impacts from multiple sources of pollution in the environmental context, many of which come from energy production, but also the socioeconomic and health stressors that add to one's vulnerability to suffering particular impacts, exacerbated impacts from that pollution, or disproportionate impacts from that pollution as compared to other communities. And so at the local level, we're seeing a lot of, now as we're adopting plans in accordance with SB 1000 implementation, and we're seeing a lot of local land use agencies refer to statewide tools and regional tools that really kind of develop metrics and measurements around what some of the indicators are that they should be looking at to identify where communities might be in need of additional support, and to identify what that additional support might be. We use a tool called CalEnviroScreen for this purpose. It's very similar to EJScreen, which exists at the national level. But CalEnviroScreen really looks at not only various causes of pollution, but also things like low birth weight for infants, asthma hospitalization rates, which even in a place like the Bay Area, where there is a significant amount of investment and a pretty healthy local economy, there are certainly pockets where these types of health indicators show us that something is wrong. Something is wrong and still in our communities. And so it's really for compelling our local land use decision makers to think about that as they're approaching their land use decision making. I think the other point that now is so more important than ever, perhaps, is like thinking about the intersection between the need for housing and addressing some of these impacts. And I think this has a clear correlation to energy production, particularly as we're moving toward decarbonizing our buildings as a way to get to some of our greenhouse gas reduction goals and our climate goals. There is, to Alice's point, this perceived inherent tension between decarbonization and affordability. And so one of the conversations that it's really forcing at the local level in the context of environmental justice and local land use planning is how our cities and counties and how we as a state are going to deal with the severe affordability crisis that we have while providing housing and critical needed building infrastructure for our communities in a way that doesn't disadvantage our low-income residents, where our low-income residents are not shouldering the burden as ratepayers for our transition to a decarbonized economy, including in our buildings and in our housing. So I think it's an area ripe with a lot of potential. I think we have some lessons learned to one of your earlier points, Judy, around the placement and prioritization of drinking water infrastructure that we can learn from. And there we've seen a lot of very local community oversight in the prioritization of siting of infrastructure and how that infrastructure should be managed. Building committees that are made up of residents to understand what is going on with their drinking water services and their sanitation access. So we're looking at more and more models of sort of local oversight and partnership between community residents and their local governments, and often, and I think this will be growing, their utility service providers as well.
That's super interesting. Yesterday, your counterpart, Kate, at this governor's office was talking about equity as being jobs, 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 which we hope to talk about today too. But I think you're bringing a really important counterbalance to that, which is housing, 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 which we've heard a lot about in the equity and energy movement, which is a great segue back over to Alice. Alice, I think about Xcel Energy, and I like I say, being here in Colorado, I have a little more close perspective on not just what you guys are doing, delivering to end users, but to your communities. And here we are in the pandemic and how much that disrupts and upends your operations and your services and so forth. So since you started off on such a bright note, keep us bright. Like, what do you think post-pandemic are some of the great lessons in delivering equity and to your communities? What are some things that might be here to stay, so to speak, if you will, and lessons that we can take on equity?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Yeah, I think one of the unique and great things of being a utility provider is we have what's known as an obligation to serve, which means we serve every single customer that's lives, works, plays in the area that we have been identified as responsible for inside of our state. What that means is that every single person gets an equivalent non-discriminatory level of service. And I know a lot of people are probably sitting out there going, well, what does that mean? What it means is that, we really have to be incredibly transparent about what it is that we are doing and what it is that we are providing. Now, there's some great things that were, just discussed, and, some of the focuses of as we're making this transition and what do we look at as post-pandemic. First off, one of the learnings that I would take away is our pandemic response plan that we had before experiencing this pandemic is going to be very different afterwards. We learned a lot in moving through the process. We learned how we're connected even more than we realized to the various other essential services inside of the state, whether that was to the healthcare workers and using some of the inventories that we had on personal protective equipment to support them, or vice versa, just looking at, okay, how do we make their resources and their facilities more resilient in these times because of how critical they are. I think from a utilities perspective and just bringing it really close to home, we recognize how important our field employees are. How do we take care of them? How do we recognize the fact that they didn't have the luxury of staying in their homes? We needed them out in the field. All of us needed them out in the field to continue doing what it is that they do, whether it was constructing something new or restoring after a snowstorm or a bad weather event. We need them out there in the field. And so we really have to be cognizant of how we participate. But the other piece of the puzzle from a utility perspective is we are our communities because of how connected we are with all of the individuals and the businesses in those communities. We really do play a very large role in making sure that not only do they survive through this, but they come out the other side thriving. One of the areas that we recognized early on is small businesses. Small business and entrepreneurs really drive significant economic development in the state of Colorado. And making sure that they have the wherewithal to be able to stay online, to continue doing the things that they need to do was incredibly important. We focused that concentration here in Colorado, and we actually put our money where our mouth is. And through our foundation, we contributed, or we're in the process of contributing $750,000 to the Colorado Restaurant Association, because many of the restaurants and small businesses that we have around here, because of the restrictions of having to reduce their dining rooms to smaller sizes, they went outdoors. They expanded into the street, onto the sidewalks. They set up, tents and patios so that they could survive through what we are all experiencing right now. Well, the Colorado winter is setting in, and that is something that you have to face and you have to focus on and figure out how do you continue even through these times. And so the dollars that we're contributing will help them get through the winter months by building, outdoor seating that is comfortable, that people can come in and that's safe. So hopefully, this pandemic passes and we don't see one for a very long time, if again, ever. But we have definitely learned from it. We've grown closer to our communities and recognizing how do we connect more there. I think the other thing that we're revising simultaneously is we've always, I can't say always, over the past several years, we have doubled down our efforts on looking at supplier diversity. Small, low-income, minority-owned businesses, women-owned businesses, those are absolutely areas that we have started to focus on. Here in the state of Colorado, we spend over $1 billion a year. And I'm really excited to say that over 30% of that is now going to these smaller diversity, diverse suppliers. And that's something we're going to continue to look at and figure out how do we continue moving that forward, because that's really where the grassroots comes from, where you can continue to focus and invest in these small businesses, minority-owned businesses, and grow the future to give larger levels of success that are breaking down some of the barriers that we've seen built in the past. So good things to come, good lessons learned, a lot more to come from it, and more to learn from other people. If we have a chance, I'd love to get into the water discussion at some point, but I'll sit back because I know you have lots of great questions coming in from the audience, and I don't want to dig too deep on an area that maybe they're not as interested in.
Yeah, sure. Well, we'll see if we can get to that. 30% of $1 billion. Thank you so much for your generosity and philanthropy and support of equity and energy from Xcel Energy. So yeah, we do have a bunch of questions. And so Shalanda, I want to come to you now. As you know, I have a question for you, but actually there's questions from the audience that are pretty similar to mine. And so I wanted to share a hello to Professor Shalanda, somebody from the audience from Houston, currently in Golden, Colorado, asking how can we get involved with your initiative for energy justice? You're the co-founder of this initiative. And it's sort of in the vein of what I was going to ask. Can you speak to us more about what you mean by a civil rights movement and what we can do? There are other questions in this stream that are in the same vein for all of our panelists, to the extent that you can share really specific examples that I think the audience is just hungry to do something. This is a topic that hits us all, I think, in our gut, and we are eager to do something. So with that, Shalanda, can you share, how do we get involved in your movement, and what are some tips of things that we can be doing?
Sure. So I just got a weird pop-up, but I think you can hear me okay, right? Okay, excellent. Well, so first of all, I'll just say, check us out online, iejusa.org. That's a very simple way to kind of find out what we're about. And then I do want to get into kind of a real answer and get a little bit deeper into the weeds by building on something that Yana started with. And that is that we can't have big wins on climate without having frontline engagement. And that became very apparent to me while I was in Hawaii. And I was having so many conversations with really wonky, very technical, major stakeholders in that state's transition. And I would always sort of end my conversation with them by saying, okay, well, how do communities play a role, and how can they participate in this? Because I really saw the energy transition as an opportunity for deeper structural transformation. And I had no reason to think that, other than the fact that there is an intimate connection between BIPOC communities and the energy system, and in particular, the electricity sector. And that was playing out in a real way in Hawaii. Folks there pay among the highest costs in the country for electricity. So an energy transition implicates their lives, right? And can affect the bottom line. People were making difficult choices about food and paying the electricity bill. So that's a real connection. Those same communities were burdened by fossil fuel generation. So the energy transition is important, right, to changing their circumstances. Those are the same communities, though, that were being sought out for clean energy development without their participation on issues of siting, and absolutely without their participation economically. And we've seen models in Europe and other places where there is an equity participation, meaning an economic participatory element in that transition. So I'm really interested in having communities participate in, understanding the sort of the design of our future energy system. And there are a lot of ways to do that. I think that the examples that Yana pointed out were very helpful. There are other examples at the federal level. We have, the president-elect coming in with ambitious goals to move 40% of all climate dollars to frontline environmental justice communities. That means that we have to engage them in the design. It can't just be a blank check, right? It has to be transformative, and it will inherently be transformative because of the amount, but there's such an opportunity there. In New York, we have the Climate Leadership Community Protection Act that was signed into law last summer that requires a similar investment in frontline environmental justice communities. That win only happened by frontline organizing. And so it was a win not only for EJ communities, but it's a win for all of us because they moved mitigation, right? And they are the ones that were sort of part and parcel to that ambitious climate legislation. California, SB 535, that's contested in many ways, the cap and trade dollars moving to frontline communities. But these are wins on the mitigation front that also incorporate a frontline element. So there's so much more to say. And I know that there are tons of questions that I can't see, but yeah. Judy, I'll trust you to facilitate and direct those questions my way.
Yeah, I love how you say mitigation, but with a frontline element. And some of the questions are kind of picking up on that. I think people are reacting to some of the stories about how you got started with this and your work in Mexico with utility scale wind and indigenous peoples being impacted. And Yana, some of your stories about how there's this coincidence between, let's say, even rail lines and large energy production across tribal lands. And so one of the questions is, so what can the big guys be doing to be more, I'm paraphrasing here, a little more sensitive to the frontline needs while we have such urgency at scale around mitigation projects? And by extension, I just wanted to give a nod to we had one from Texas A&M actually asking on behalf of small businesses, like, what's the opportunity? And as a small business owner myself, like, what are the opportunities that where maybe some of these small businesses can help fill gaps and what's needed in delivering frontline sensitive at scale and pace mitigation. So I guess I would put that to really any three of you. I think they're kind of asking some great questions here about like, how can we do that? And maybe I bring it back to you, Yana, first, just because these questions are pretty specific to Indigenous sovereignty and, you know, related topics around that too, in terms of the mitigation development projects. Any reactions?
Sure. Yeah. Well, so I'm going to pick up on the question about what can some of the big guys do, maybe. I think that's very timely for many of us, particularly for us in government, as we are looking at down the barrel of a continued economic crisis affecting our bottom line, our budget for public dollars, and the need for public-private partnerships moving forward, the growing importance of that during this particular economic moment. You know, from the regulatory perspective, you know, there is a lot certainly that we can do. I think we can all recognize how much more quickly funds can move in the private sector than regulations can often move. And so one of the things that comes immediately to mind for me, particularly for the bigger guys and gals, is to learn from some of the local successes we've had. And I'll talk a little bit about some of the work that's going on in the San Joaquin Valley around both drinking water infrastructure, but also around some building decarbonization pilots, some new housing that has been built in the San Joaquin Valley that is all electric and has been piloted with community oversight to, you know, one of Shalanda's points around our clean energy transition really having to happen with community input. And I think that that's often an area of interesting discomfort, I think generally because it's just not the habitual way of doing business. But it's so critically important as we approach the need to obviously invest in these communities and invest in cleaner energy alternatives. And in particular in the housing context, I'll just go with that a little bit because as you mentioned, Judy, with Director Gordon yesterday, you know, we have a lot of a great need to focus on jobs, certainly, and on housing. And the unfortunate reality that too many communities of color face is that there's this narrative that it's jobs or housing, economic growth or health, environmental health, or, you know, any sort of new investment. And it's a fundamentally unjust position to put our communities in, to have to consistently make that choice, to feel like they have to choose between access to jobs, access to affordable services, or their health, or something that could be cleaner. And I think that it's an unfortunate effect of some of the ways in which we've built these prioritized systems to look at communities that have suffered from historical disinvestment as a focus area, but not a resource. And so from the private sector, as well as from the public, but since the question is about the private sector, you know, really thinking about how we might be able to think outside the box and do things completely voluntarily, you know, sort of in a new groundbreaking way in some ways, to bring community residents in to the early decision making, to crafting a new project, to crafting a new initiative or agenda, helps us kind of debunk those sort of unfair choices that our communities are too often faced with, while also leveraging, you know, resources, creativity, and the ability to build some of the newer solutions that we're hoping to be able to continue to incentivize over time. SB 535, of course, out here in California, which is a way to focus much of our investment from our cap and trade program into communities that are disproportionately burdened by pollution sources is one way to think about opening up the ability to have access to prioritized funds to fund various projects that do yield greenhouse gas reduction. So that's been a good way to kind of bring folks to the table from the investment side. But again, to Shalanda's point, really bringing in the communities where those investment dollars should be focused to actually think about the design of what those projects can be, the design of what those investments could actually yield.
That's great. Anybody want to add on to that,
jump...
Alice? Yeah, please.
Yeah, I'd love to. So I think Yana is going exactly in the direction that we have found to be the most helpful is sit down and listen. It sounds really simple, but simply going into the communities that you either serve or that you may be moving into is incredibly important. And it's something that we have found, pays dividends because then you hear what it is that they want and you can deliver in the directions that they want. So I'll talk two ends of the spectrum just really quickly here. One end of the spectrum is we're closing 2 coal plants, 660 megawatts, 85 job delta at the plant itself, tax base for the community. It's in a rural community in the southern portion of Colorado. And we knew that it was coming. And so we're sitting there and we're looking at, okay, how do you work with the community to make this something that is a good experience, can be a positive transition, and continues moving in the right direction? So we sat down with that community before we went to our regulators with the proposal, and we said, look, here's what we think could very well happen. Is we thought that, okay, your tax base is going to largely be replaced by resources that are going to be built in your county. And ultimately, when we got the results back from our acquisition process, we not only met the tax base that needed to be replaced, but we exceeded it, and it's all with solar facilities being built in the same county. And so there are ways and there are pathways you can get there, but you also have to work closely with those communities to identify what's important to them. Is it replacement of jobs? Is it replacement of tax base? Is it replacement of, how long do they want things to be there? And so sitting down and listening and having those dialogues early and often is incredibly important. The other end of the spectrum, what I'll talk about is the build out of wind generation. There's lots of discussion about not in my backyard. Don't build that transmission line here. Don't build the wind farm here. Don't build the solar farm here. Don't put that substation at that location. That's not everywhere. There are certain communities that open their arms and embrace it. And so making sure that you're really working with the communities that, are interested in moving in that direction, it's another lesson to be learned for us. And moving with particularly the wind farm development in our rural communities is largely embraced because most of that land they can continue to use for their farming, their ranching, and their other activities. And then they get a second crop of that payment for having the wind farm located on their property. And so, but it's really about respect and working with them to make sure that you're meeting the needs that they have. And whether that's respecting the fact that there's going to be more traffic on their roads, and so you need to be replacing those and really working on them. There's just a whole bunch of different things. But at the crux of it, sit down, have a conversation, listen. If you don't understand, ask more questions, get the perspective so that when your decisions are made, you can move forward with community support and in a way that they really wanted to see happen.
Can I just jump in, Judy? Great, because this is where it gets interesting, right? This is where the conversation is I think, going to get textured. So I love Alice because she is a great president of a utility, but fundamentally, many utilities are at odds, and the business model of utilities is at odds with this transition, and I think in many ways at odds with a just transition and an equitable one. And that's primarily because of the way that utilities are regulated, right? They're regulated to allow for a reasonable return on investments. So they're encouraged to invest in infrastructure that is utility infrastructure. And some of that infrastructure is not infrastructure that's necessarily needed for this transition. It also sort of butts up against the idea of more local decentralized energy generation, like rooftop solar and other community-owned projects. So there's a little bit of tension there, and it's the regulatory model. I think also the sort of the revenue stream is selling energy and selling electricity, right? And so the more that is sold, the more profitable the company can be and distribute its dividends to shareholders, right? These are shareholder-owned entities, investor-owned utilities are what I'm primarily talking about. And so that incentive to sell electricity butts up against, again, local distributed energy that kind of cuts into that revenue stream. And so I'm not beating up utilities at all. That's not what I'm about to do. I think the answer, I think, is regulation and sort of pushing utilities in the right way. I don't think we're going to see the end of utilities in my lifetime, but I do think we're going to see a transformation of them. And Alice, you're reminding me of our former CEO of Green Mountain Power out here, who has moved on, who was an innovator and who saw kind of the writing on the wall. And it was like, I want to participate in this energy transition and not and facilitate it. And how can we, maintain a vibrant business model, even though we want more clean energy on the grid. And she was very innovative in that way. But I do think it's worth kind of talking about this broader structural problem. And in California, it's so evident, right? We have widespread utility-initiated preemptive power shutoffs that are in part because the utilities are unable to maintain their own infrastructure. That, by the way, ratepayers are paying for. And if you want to drill down even further, people of color disproportionately pay for it because they have a higher energy burden. So we have to kind of deal with, the way that these dimensions are playing out. And this is the violence that we need to contend with that is baked into the energy system. And Judy, to answer your question about civil rights, this is why I see this as such a ripe domain to advance civil rights. If we can figure out how to regulate utilities so that they are truly acting in the public interest and for social benefit, then I think we're in the right direction. If we can lower energy burden in Black, Indigenous, people of color communities, and if we can get them in that energy democracy train. Right now, the folks who are benefiting from this energy transition are not people of color. And there have been many studies showing that folks who've been able to access solar are predominantly white communities. And so this is all, up on the table and up for grabs. And we're in a fantastic moment for that transformation.
Yeah,
awesome.
I agree. Can't agree with you more. Shalanda, sorry, Judy, I have to jump in here because there are things that we're doing trying to close this gap. I mean, we are ardently trying to close the gap. Things like we just announced the other day that we're building community solar gardens that are for low income and income adjusted, families alone. They are the only ones that will be allowed to subscribe to them. And we found ways to make that so that the pricing doesn't increase their bill at all. In fact, it decreases their bill going forward. So finding ways and collaborating with others in the community to deliver on those things is going to be something we have to continue to do. But I also agree with you. We are not regulated in a way that drives us towards just that common social good. And now I would argue with you that maybe there is reason to go some that way, but maybe not all that way. There's a lot, though, that we do that is for the public interest purely because of just the way that we are regulated. So yes, there's so much we could talk about and dig into here. I wish we had another 2 hours.
Yeah, I really wish we did too, because that is that whole dynamic between public and community will and regulation, policy, et cetera, is just such a fascinating intersection. And I just wanted to say, Shalanda, that really was a clear explanation. It was nice to hear you describe your vision around the energy civil rights movement. And I wanted to acknowledge one of our audience members asked a question. We don't have time to answer it, but they acknowledged that the Navajo Nation has 30% of their people that don't even have electricity access. So in addition to, I know that this is an issue, I'm seeing heads nodding from our panelists that when we're talking about this, let's remember that we still have people in our country where we have energy access issues. So I think given what you all been discussing, this is I might as well keep going with kind of a challenging question, a quick round response in our remaining 3 minutes, maybe 30 seconds each. Our audience is really interested as your points of leadership. What would you like to see from our white men leaders in this clean energy equity transition? So maybe Alice, you're smiling and laughing and you have the stage. So yeah, bring us home. Quick 30-second top of mind. What would you like to see from our white men leaders in our equitable clean energy transition?
I think I would like to see more, sponsorships of those that are not necessarily white men, and trying to figure out, because I really do that. I'm a full subscriber to diversity of thought. And I'm sitting here just in full disclosure, I'm the mother of 4 boys. And so, that's definitely going to be an interesting future as they move forward. But I think around the table, you have to have diversity of thought. You have to have diversity of background. You have to have lots of conversations. So welcoming others to the table to have a dialogue. And I think that, it's something we're talking about inside of our own company, and that our CEO is a huge leader of as the chairman of the EEI right now, is really looking at how do we diversify our workforce inside of the utility sector. I know it's an overplayed comment. You need to look like and operate like the people that you serve. And yes, that is where we need to head. That is what we need to do, which means that we have to look at the requirements for our jobs. We have to make sure we have diverse interviewing panels. There's a whole lot of different things that we can be doing. But at the very end of the day, it really is opening the door. Because you have to have those people at the table in order for them to learn, in order for them to progress, in order for them to grow.
Great. Yana, how about you? What comes to mind on what you'd like to see from our white men?
That was a great response, Alice. But similarly, I think first and foremost, I'd say an intentional sharing of access to power, decision-making, and resources. And that takes a lot of work. It takes, I think, as I see many of my colleagues grappling with it, it takes day-to-day practice to really think about how to be intentional about sharing that access that you enjoy over the inadequate access of others. I guess I would also just say on the point of these kind of false dichotomies, jobs versus health, et cetera, to really also challenge ourselves on those, because they're so easy to grab onto. And I think increasingly, as we are seeing this pandemic just swiftly move its way through, particularly communities of color, there is a need to invest in all of it, the way that we've done so in other communities, in the jobs, in the infrastructure, in health, in just a complete and total package of recovery that our communities deserve. And so to focus on that as well.
Wonderful. Shalanda, bring us home. What are your thoughts?
I would combine both comments, which were excellent. And I would say open the door and then get out of the way, right? Because there is a wave of new leadership led by women, led by people of color, and we're coming for you. So, you can partner with us, but you got to open the door, and then you have to get out of the way, because there's some great ideas starting at the bottom and I think going all the way to the top. And we absolutely need folks in power to use that privilege to move the resources that Yana was talking about, because we're going to be in a world of hurt for a little while here. And we need smart reinvestments fueled by the ideas of folks on the ground.
I laugh because I have 6 brothers, so building on Alice's comment about 4 sons, I think that was my, and I'm the youngest, that was my motto growing up: open the door, get out of the way. So with that, I just want to give a resounding thanks to all of you, Shalanda, Alice, and Yana, for we wish we had more time for this important and engaging conversation from our experts. I would like to also please let our audience know there is another riveting conversation coming up in about 20 minutes, and it's about financing the innovators and the infrastructure. So hopefully we laid a nice groundwork for them to dive into how to make that happen through innovation and infrastructure financing. So thank you all again, and we look forward to seeing you at the break at the next panel.
Thanks, Judy.
Thank you.
Bye all.